destiny often whispers before it screams. In the rugged halls of Bella, where the torches flickered against walls adorned with the spoils of war, a young prince watched his father build a kingdom of iron. Philip was a man of the spear, a warrior who understood the brutal arithmetic of conquest. But Alexander saw something more. Staring into the fire, he saw a world waiting to be united, not just by the sword, but by the sheer, terrifying force of will. He was a boy who slept with a dagger under his pillow and the Iliad beside it, a book worn smooth by his hands, dreaming of Achilles while the rest of the world slept. When the untamable horse Bucephalus reared against his handlers, wild-eyed and terrified of his own shadow, Alexander didn't use force. He used understanding, softly turning the beast toward the sun, blinding the fear with light. It was a moment of pure insight, a realization that would define his life, that to lead, one must understand the soul of the conquered. He rode that horse not as a master breaking a servant, but as a partner, galloping toward a horizon that would soon bear his name, leaving the small, quarrelsome world of Greece behind for something vast and dangerous. The wind in his hair felt like the breath of history, pushing him toward a greatness that would consume him entire. The heavy scent of incense and horse sweat filled the air, a perfume of ambition that would soon spread from the Adriatic to the Indus, marking the beginning of the end of the old world. He stood on the edge of the known map, and instead of fear, he felt a hunger, a deep, insatiable need to see what lay beyond the jagged peaks. The tutor spoke of logic, but his heart spoke of glory, and the world trembled purely from the anticipation of his footsteps. He was Aristotle's student, learning the geometry of the stars, but war was his true master, teaching him the geometry of the battlefield. And when he crossed the Hellespont, throwing his spear into the sands of Asia, he wasn't just invading a continent, he was declaring war on the limits of human ambition itself, asking the gods to witness that a man could become a myth while he still breathed. The die was cast, and the world held its breath. The map of the world was being redrawn, not with ink, but with the footsteps of a playful god. He stood before the Gordian knot, a tangle of cornley bark so complex it had baffled wise men for centuries, and simply laughed, realizing that sometimes the only solution is to break the rules entirely. The blade fell, slicing through tradition, and Asia opened its gates. The Battle of Gaugamela wasn't a fight, it was a collision of eras. The Persian chariots charged like thunder, scythed blades spinning to harvest legs and lives. But Alexander rode straight into the dust storm, his eyes fixed not on the army, but on the king. He shattered the center, driving the wedge of the companion cavalry deep into the heart of the empire. The air tasted of iron and panic, swords clashing like the bells of hell as the great King Darius fled, leaving his crown in the dust. The sun set on the Achaemenid dynasty. Forever, Alexander stood amidst the carnage, covered in dust and glory, holding the crown of Asia, proving that fortune favors not just the bold, but the absolutely relentless. He looked out over the burning sands and saw not a battlefield, but a canvas ready to be painted with the colors of a new, unified world where East and West would finally meet in a marriage of blood and gold. The screams of the dying faded into the silence of the desert, leaving only the heavy breathing of the victors. The golden eagle of Persia had fallen, replaced by the lion of Macedon, tearing the throat out of history. Soldiers wept amidst the ruins of Persepolis, overwhelmed by the scale of their own victory, realizing they had marched off the edge of the world and survived. But in the eyes of their king, there was no satisfaction, only the restless scanning of the horizon, looking for the next river, the next mountain, the next impossible thing to conquer, establishing a legacy of motion that would never, ever stop. But the flame that burns twice as bright burns half as long. The ambition that stretched to the ends of the earth finally found a limit, not in the ice of the mountains or the heat of the deserts, but in the weary hearts of his own men, at the banks of the high faces, under a monsoon rain that felt like the tears of the gods. The dream faltered. A king who had never known defeat was forced to bow to the simple human need for home. He returned to Babylon, a conqueror with no more worlds to conquer, leaving a legacy that would echo for millennia. In the silence of the hanging gardens, the fever took him, burning away the mortality until only the myth remained. The empire fractured immediately, torn apart by generals who could not carry his weight. But the idea of him remained immortal, a reminder that the world belongs to those who dare to imagine it whole, fading now into the sands of time. The wind blows through the ruins of Persepolis, whispering the name of the man who burned it, a ghost story told by history itself, reminding us that even the greatest gods must eventually sleep in the dark, leaving only their footprints in the dust. The golden armor boils in the sun, a relic of a time when giants walked the earth and the boundaries of the possible were defined only by the reach of a spear. The silence of the desert is heavy now, covering the tracks of the phalanx, the cities he built: Alexandria, Kandahar, monuments to a restless spirit that refused to be contained by geography. He died young, leaving a corpse that was fought over like a prize. But his soul, his terrifying, beautiful soul, escaped the grave, becoming the measure against which all other conquerors would forever remain. Small, he was an outsider, a Corsican with an accent that marked him as foreign in the elite salons of Paris. Born with the restless energy of the sea in his veins, watching the waves crash against the cliffs, dreaming of a destiny far larger than his rocky home in the chaos of the revolution, when France was a city of fire and blood, and the guillotine's blade rose and fell like a grim metronome counting down the end of the monarchy. He saw a ladder where others saw only ruin. He was a mathematician of war, seeking order in the anarchy, seeing the battlefield as a grid of possibilities, managing chaos with a cold, beautiful precision. The whiff of grape shot was not just a cannon blast, it was the gavel of order slamming down. The little corporal rose from the smoke, not just a general, but a force of history, carrying the code of a new world in his pocket, ready to rewrite the laws of kings. He looked at the map of Europe and saw not nations, but pieces on a board waiting to be moved, possessed by a hunger that could never be satisfied, a need to prove that a man from nothing could become everything, armed only with his mind and a will of iron. The smell of gunpowder was his perfume. The roar of the mob was his music, and he conducted it all with the baton of a master, turning the discord of revolution into the harmony of empire. He stood alone in his tent, plotting the trajectory of cannonballs by candlelight, while outside the world burned. He was the Enlightenment on horseback, a terrifying synthesis of reason and violence, tearing down the old feudal walls, not with philosophy, but with artillery. He crowned himself emperor, taking the laurel wreath from the altar and placing it on his own brow, a gesture that screamed to the heavens, "I am the state," and for a moment, waiting for the echo, the universe agreed. The sun of Austerlitz rose on a frozen morning, illuminating a masterpiece of deception. He played the emperors of Europe like pieces on a chessboard, feigning weakness to draw them into the trap, abandoning the high ground, a gamble of staggering genius. The mist obscured the valley, hiding the steel jaws of the French army. Expecting a retreat, the Allies marched into the hollow, and then the trap snapped shut. The attack came from the soul of the fog, shattering the center. The ice of the Sachan ponds cracked under the weight of retreating men, swallowing the old order whole. Cannon cannons roaring like the applause of history, he stood at the summit, the master of a continent, redrawing borders with the stroke of a pen, believing that he was the spirit of the age on horseback, carrying the torch of the Enlightenment, even as the shadows of his own ambition grew longer, surrounding him in a twilight of his own making. The victory was absolute, a dazzling display of intellect applied to violence, creating a legend that would freeze the blood of kings for a generation, proving that a single mind could outweigh the heritage of 1,000 years. The silence that followed was heavy with awe. The world held its breath, realizing that the rules of war had been rewritten by a single, terrifying genius. The Grande Armée cheered until their throats were raw. Vive l'Empereur! A sound that rolled across the frozen plains like thunder, sealing the doom of the Holy Roman Empire. He sat on his grey horse, impassive, looking not at the victory, but at the horizon, already planning the next campaign, the next triumph, creating a momentum that could not be stopped until it finally, inevitably, ran out of road. The snow was stained red, a stark reminder that glory is always bought in blood. Hubris is the ghost that haunts the great. The march into Russia was a journey into the void. The vast emptiness swallowed the army. The silence of the snow, more deadly than any cannon. He found Moscow a burning pyre, a city that refused to be conquered, a hollow victory turning to ash in his mouth. The retreat was a tragedy written in ice, a long, slow unraveling of the legend. Ends do not always come with glory. Sometimes they come on a lonely rock in the Atlantic, staring at the indifferent ocean. The man who ruled millions died a prisoner of his own memory, arguing with captors about rations, dreaming of a France that had moved on, leaving behind a myth that would overshadow reality for centuries to come. The Cold Dome in Paris shines over a man who tried to conquer the world, only to find that the world was always bigger than the man. The silence of St. Helena was the final prison where the eagle was chained, forced to watch the sun set over an empire that existed only in his mind, a lesson in the ultimate frailty of human ambition. The waves crashing against the shore were the only applause left, a rhythmic reminder that nature conquers all, eroding the cliffs of history. Grain by grain, he wrote his memoirs in the damp gloom, refining the statue of his own life, polishing the marble until it shone, creating a legend of martyrdom that would resurrect his name, even from the grave. The little corporal sleeps now in a coffin of red porphyry, guarded by the ghosts of his victories, a giant who proved that a single will can bend the arc of history, even if it ultimately snaps back. Hatred can be a fuel, burning cold and steady, forged in the temples of Carthage. A boy's hand placed on the altar, swearing an oath that would shape the history of the Mediterranean. I will never be a friend to Rome. He knew that to defeat the giant, he had to do the impossible. Crossing the Alps was madness, a suicide mission against nature itself. Thousands died in the snow, slipping from the icy paths into the abyss, falling silently into the white void. But greatness lives in the refusal to accept limits. He led elephants through the clouds, defying the mountains, appearing in the green fields of Italy like a nightmare from the north. It was a shock that froze the blood of the Senate, proving that the walls of the world are only as strong as the will of the men who defend them. He was a ghost in their garden, waiting in the mist to show the arrogant republic the true meaning of fear, burning the villas of the rich, turning the heartland of Italy into a graveyard. He was not just a general, he was a wraith, a punishment sent to remind Rome that they were mortal. The peasants whispered his name in the dark, believing he was a demon sent to devour their children, a shadow that grew longer with every victory. His eye patch covered a wound, but his mind was sharp as a gladiator's, seeing the terrain not as land, but as a weapon. He turned rivers into traps and fog into walls, hunting the legions in their own home. For 15 years, he was the wolf in the fold, uncatchable, unstoppable, a terrifying brilliance that taught the Romans that even the eagle can be hunted, falling from the sky with a broken wing. There is a kind of ardent slaughter, a terrible symmetry. At Cannae, he painted his masterpiece on a canvas of dust. He understood the arrogance of strength, allowing the Roman legions to push into his center, bending but not breaking, drawing them into a deadly embrace. The trap closed with the precision of a steel jaw, turning their own numbers against them. The dust rose to hide the sun, as 70,000 men were pressed so close they could not lift their swords, panic rippling through the ranks like a wave. It was the perfect battle, a lesson in tactics that would be studied for 2,000 years. On that day, he held the heart of Rome in his hand, squeezing it until it stopped beating, walking among the gold rings of the fallen, the undisputed master of the field, seeking a victory that would break their spirit forever. The river ran red-brown with the blood of the equestrian class, a generational trauma that would teach Rome a lesson they would never forget. Never surrender, only destroy until the threat is gone forever. The silence of the battlefield was broken only by the wind, blowing through the empty helmets of the legions, a hollow sound of absolute defeat. He looked at the of rings sent back to Carthage, each one representing a dead Roman senator, and wondered why they did not sue for peace. Miscalculating the stubbornness of the wolf, he won the battle, but in doing so, he woke the beast, teaching it that survival required total war, a lesson that would eventually lead to the destruction of his own home. But a battle is not a war, and genius is not enough against the grinding weight of a nation's resolve. He spent years as a ghost in Italy, undefeated but unsupported, watching his moment slip away. The tragedy of Hannibal is the tragedy of the solitary brilliance, facing the relentless machine of the state. When he finally met his match at Zama, it was like looking in a mirror, seeing his own tactics turned against him by a student who had learned too well. The end was a wandering exile, hunted from court to court, a vial of poison in a ring, a final act of defiance. He died as he lived, on his own terms, a shadow that would terrify Rome forever, a name used to frighten children in the night. Hannibal at Portas. Hannibal is at the gates. The ruins of Carthage are gone now, sown with salt. But the fear he planted in the Roman soul grew into an empire of its own, a dark seed that would eventually consume the world. Even now, when the wind blows from the north, you can almost hear the trumpets calling the ghosts to war. The elephants are dust, the mercenaries are forgotten, but the name remains, cut into the bedrock of history, a symbol of the ultimate underdog, the man who made the gods of Rome tremble, and almost brought the eternal city to its knees, leaving a question mark hanging over the ancient world. What if? A whisper that still haunts the corridors of time. She was not merely a beauty. She was a mind, sharp as a diamond, fighting for survival in a court of vipers. Egypt was crumbling, a glorious ruin of ancient power, and she saw the only path to salvation lay in the iron grip of Rome. She didn't enter history walking. She was carried in, wrapped in a carpet, a surprise gift to Caesar that would change the world. When the bundle unrolled, he found not a supplicant begging for mercy, but an equal, fierce, and intelligent, speaking his language. It was a partnership of power, a fusion of the ancient magic of the Nile with the cold steel of the legions. She secured her throne not with swords, but with the unbreakable bonds of alliance, turning the conqueror into a protector. Believing she could tame the wolf of Rome, she walked the halls of the Ptolemies, ghosts of Alexander's generals, whispering in her ear, telling her that power is not given, it is taken, seized with both hands, and held with a grip of iron. She was the last flame of a dying fire, determined to burn bright enough to blind the world. using every weapon in her arsenal, wit, charm, and the terrifying allure of absolute power. The library of Alexandria smelled of papyrus and dust, but her court smelled of lotus and myrrh, an intoxicating blend of the intellectual and the sensual. She spoke 9 languages and needed no interpreter to command the loyalty of her people. She was Isis reborn, a living goddess, playing a game of high stakes diplomacy where the chips were kingdoms and the penalty for losing was extinction. To seduce a man is one thing, to seduce history is another. She met Mark Antony on a barge of gold, sailing up the Cydnus River, dressed as the goddess of love, purple sails swelling in the wind, flutes playing soft melodies. It was theatre grander than any stage, a display of wealth and sensation that intoxicated the Roman general. They created a life of inimitable livers, a decade of decadence and defiance, challenging the rigid morality of the West. She dreamed of a new empire, a Hellenistic fusion ruled from Alexandria, where the sun never set on their glory. For a moment, the world held its breath, dazzled by the brilliance of the Queen of Kings and her Roman lover, intertwined in a dance of cosmic defiance against the inevitable tide. They were stars orbiting each other, burning so bright that they threatened to outshine Rome itself. A challenge that could not be ignored by the cold, calculating eyes watching from the west, calling for blood to extinguish the light. The feasts lasted for days, wine flowing like the Nile, washing away the fears of the future. Small tactical errors compounded into strategic disaster, but the style never wavered. They lived as gods on earth, drinking dissolved pearls and laughing in the face of doom, creating a legend of romance that would outlast the empire that destroyed them, proving that while Rome conquered the world with iron, Egypt conquered the imagination with gold and desire. The serpent waits at the end of every dream. The Battle of Actium was the turning of the tide, the cold reality of Octavian crushing the romantic vision. The fleets collided, and hope sank beneath the waves. But she would not be a trophy. She would not walk in chains through the streets of Rome. The mausoleum became her sanctuary, the final stage for her greatest performance. The asp was her key to freedom, a symbol of royalty delivering the kiss of death. She died on a golden couch, crowned and regal, denying Rome its final victory. She was the last pharaoh, leaving the world not with a whimper, but with the silent dignity of a goddess descending into the underworld, undefeated in spirit, leaving a legend that would outlast the stone of her tomb. The age of pharaohs ended with a quiet breath, closing the book on 3,000 years of history, but her image remains, stamped on the coin of our imagination, visible Even now, a queen who refused to bend the knee, choosing death over dishonor, becoming eternal in the process. The waters of the Mediterranean reclaimed her palace, hiding the sphinxes and the statues in a blue tomb. But they could not drown the story. Age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety. Shakespeare wrote, capturing the magic that Rome tried to erase. She remains the ultimate queen, the woman who made the world stop and look and remember. He was the boy who shouldn't have mattered, sickly and young, underestimated by the wolves of the Senate. They called him the boy, unlocking the cage of a wolf they thought they could control. But inside the fragile frame was a mind of ice, calculating and patient. When Caesar fell, he didn't scream, he plotted, he signed the proscriptions, marking thousands for death, washing the streets of Rome in blood to secure the peace. He was the architect of a new order, understanding that to build a marble city, one must first clear the rubble of the Republic ruthlessly, efficiency becoming his religion, turning the chaos of freedom into the silence of empire. He navigated the treacherous waters of Roman politics like a shark, never sleeping, never blinking, always moving forward, devouring those who stood in his way, untroubled by conscience, driven only by the cold necessity of power, believing that he alone was the savior Rome needed. The screams of the proscribed echoed in the forum, but he heard only the silence of order, a terrible symphony conducted by a master. The red lists were nailed to the rostra, names of the condemned fluttering in the wind, a paper graveyard generated by a single cold signature. He wore the mask of humility, calling himself merely Princeps, first citizen, while holding the reins of the entire world. He replaced the chaotic shouting of the forum with the quiet whisper of the palace, a trade that Rome accepted with a sigh of relief, exchanging the dangerous freedom of the Republic for the golden cage of the Empire, unknowing that the lock had just clicked shut forever. He laid the bricks of the Empire, turning a city of mud into a city of marble. The Pax Romana was his gift, a silence enforced by the sword. He closed the temple of Janus, signifying a peace the world had never known. But imagine the cost, the spies, the exiles, the slow suffocation of the Republic. He was the first citizen, a humble mask hiding the face of a god, subtly weaving the threads of power until they were an unbreakable net, holding the civilized world in his cold, capable hands, trading their voice for bread and circuses. The Senate praised him while he stripped them of power, a masterclass masterclass in manipulation, proving that the greatest tyranny is the one that people welcome with open arms, believing it to be their salvation. He controlled the grain, the legions, and the narrative, a trifecta of total dominance. The poets sang his praises, for they knew that to sing otherwise was to invite the silence of the grave. He was the first modern dictator, understanding that true power is not just about force, but about perception, convincing the world that his will was their desire. The statues of him look eternally young, a frozen perfection that never ages, just like the system he built, the bureaucracy ground on, efficient and heartless, a machine made of men serving the idea of Rome. Long after the spirit of Rome had died, he created a peace that was really just a pause between the wars of the past and the wars of the future. He lived too long, watching his bloodline wither, his family a tragedy of betrayal and death. The man who ruled the world died an old actor asking for applause. Have I played the part well? He left a structure that would stand for centuries, a monument to the terrifying power of a single will. Now, the mausoleum stands empty, the bronze letters stripped away, mocking the permanence he sought. Rome fell, but the idea of the emperor, the man above the law, remains his eternal, dangerous legacy. The marble columns he raised still stand in the sun, casting long shadows over the history of the West, a reminder that order comes at a price, and that price is often the freedom to dream. His ghost still walks the Palatine Hill, a quiet, terrifying figure who taught the world that freedom is a fragile thing, easily traded for safety. The wind whispers through the ruins, telling the story of the man who found a city of brick and left it a city of marble and a graveyard of liberty. He created a template for power that every dictator would follow, a mix of spectacle and surveillance, bread and iron, proving that the Republic did not die with a bang, but with a whisper, signed into law by a careful, sickly man who smiled as he closed the gates of the future, leaving us to wonder if the trade was worth it. He was the great fool of Owari, a wild youth who threw incense at his father's funeral, mocking the gods, mocking the past. But beneath the madness lay a vision sharp as a katana. He saw a Japan fracturing into 1,000 pieces and decided to weld it back together with fire. He danced before the Battle of Okehazama, singing of life as a fragile dream, then struck like lightning, shattering an army 10 times his size. He was the demon Japan needed, a force of chaos, destined to bring order through the sword. The rise of the Oda clan began in the rain, changing Japan forever. He looked at the samurai code and saw rust, deciding that a gun was better than a sword, and a peasant with a rifle was better than a master with a blade, disrupting the social order to save the nation. He was a storm that cleared the air, leaving a terrible clarity in his wake. The smell of ozone and blood followed him, a scent that terrified his enemies and intoxicated his followers. The musket balls tore through the wooden shields, shattering the illusion of invincibility, proving that tradition is no match for technology. He stood amidst the burning temples, the ashes of centuries of prayer drifting down like black snow. He feared no karma, he feared no hell, for he believed he was creating a new heaven, a unified land under one banner. Tenka Fubu, rule the empire by force, a brutal motto for a brutal time, inscribed on his seal, stamped onto the soul of a nation that would never be the same again. He embraced the gun when others clung to the sword. At Nagashino, his arquebuses volleyed in rhythm, a machine of death tearing through the age of chivalry. He burned the temples of Mount Yei, slaughtering the monks, declaring that no god stood above his law. He built Azuchi Castle, a tower reaching for the heavens, a symbol of absolute dominion. He was the unifier, the destroyer, the man who poured the foundation of modern Japan in a concrete of blood and ash. He sat in the golden room of his castle, looking out over a land he had pacified with terror, believing that peace bought with blood was still ultimately peace. The smoke of the burning temples rose as an offering, not to the gods, but to his own ambition, proving that the divine right of kings is decided by who has the most gunpowder. The thunder of his guns heralded a new age, where honor was measured in range and victory went to the ruthless. The tea ceremony became a political weapon, a moment of calm before the slaughter, emphasizing the duality of his nature, poet and killer. He collected tea bowls as avidly as he collected heads, finding beauty in the midst of horror, a complex aesthetic that defined the Azuchi Momoyama period. Gold leaf and blood, silk and steel, innovation and destruction, intertwined in the figure of one man who refused to be bound by the rules of men or gods. But the fire eventually consumes the arsonist. At Honnoji, the betrayal came from within. His own general turned the blade, trapping the demon king in a burning temple. He didn't run. He retreated to the inner sanctum, performing the tea ceremony as the flames licked the walls, fierce and calm to the end. He vanished into the ash, leaving no body, only a legend. Now, castles are tourist sites, but the spirit of Nobunaga, the ambition to rule all under heaven, still burns in the history of the rising sun, a comet that burned too bright to last, but scorched the earth enough for a new nation to grow, deeply rooted in the ash of his burning, reminding us that the modern world was forged not in negotiation, but in the fire of total war. The teacup remains a symbol of the stillness at the center of the storm, the quiet dignity of a man who knew how to die as well as he knew how to kill. The Japan he left behind was a fortress unified by fear and awe. His successors would finish the work, but he was the architect, the man who drew the blueprints in blood, proving that sometimes a demon is required to drive out the ghosts of the past and clear the way for the rising sun, leaving a legacy that is as sharp and as cold as a blade. He was a boy king in a nest of vipers, surviving assassins, surviving his own mother. He learned early that the world respects only strength. He unleashed the Jin war machine, a juggernaut of black armor, rolling over 6 kingdoms, ending centuries of war in a single decade. In 221 BC, he did the unthinkable. He declared himself the first emperor, erasing the past. Imagine the audacity to say that history begins with you. He was the dragon, coiling around the heart of the world, squeezing it into a single, unified shape. Imagine the audacity to look at the warring states with their different scripts and coins and say no more, creating a nation out of chaos by the sheer force of his terror and his genius. He viewed the world not as a collection of people, but as a machine, and he was the only mechanic destined to fix it. The grinding of the chariot wheels was the sound of progress, crushing the old ways into dust. The black banners of Jin snapped in the wind, a flock of ravens announcing the death of the old world. He unified the writing so that a decree written in the capital could be read in the furthest province, binding the minds of his people as tightly as he bound their bodies. He was a visionary without pity, a builder without a heart, seeing humans only as bricks to be placed in the great wall of his ambition, creating a structure that would outlast the stone and the bone of those who built it. He built the wall, a spine of stone twisting through the mountains like a sleeping dragon. Tens of thousands of men died laying its foundations, their bones buried in the mortar to keep out the night. He burned the books, burying the scholars alive, silencing the voices of the past to secure the future. It was a brutal clarity. One language, one currency, one mind. He possessed a mania for order, standardizing even the width of cart axles, knitting the empire together with iron laws. He was the father of China, but a father who ruled with a heavy hand, believing that peace could only be maintained by the terrifying certainty of the state. The smoke of burning bamboo scrolls darkened the sky, erasing wisdom to make room for law. A trade he made without blinking, knowing that uniformity was the only shield against chaos. The cries of the scholars were drowned out by the scratching of scribes, writing the new laws that would bind the empire for eternity. He created a bureaucracy that would survive every dynasty, a machine of government that ran on paper and ink, efficient, cold, and eternal. He toured his empire in a carriage with blinds drawn, a mysterious presence, feared but unseen, checking the straightness of his roads and the obedience of his subjects, ensuring that the dream of unity did not unravel at the edges, crushing dissent before it could even be whispered. A lonely god, patrolling his creation, but he could not conquer death. The elixir of life became his poison. Mercury drove him into madness, seeing sea monsters in the waves. The dragon died far from home, his body hidden in a cart of rotting fish to mask the smell. The dynasty collapsed in years, but the empire lasted millennia. Now, the terracotta warriors stand in silent rows, guarding an empty tomb, faces of clay staring into the dark, waiting for an order that will never come. The rivers of mercury in his tomb still flow, or so the legends say, circling a map of the world he conquered, deep beneath the earth where the first emperor sleeps, dreaming of an eternity he could not buy, trapped in the very earth he once commanded, a silent prisoner of his own magnificent ambition. The silence of the tomb is heavy, pressing down with the weight of mountains, preserving the secret of the man who tried to be a god. Peasants digging a well found his army, staring back at them from the dust, a terrifying reminder of the scale of his power. He united China, but he broke its heart, leaving a legacy that is equal parts pride and terror, a dragon that sleeps but never truly dies, watching over the Middle Kingdom with the eyes of clay and a heart of stone. She was an illiterate peasant girl in a land of burning villages, but she heard voices in the garden, Saint Michael whispering of a destiny too big for a shepherdess. Save France. Imagine the weight, the terrifying absurdity of the command. She cut her hair, donned the armor of a man, and rode to the king. She walked into the court, a beacon of pure faith in a room of cynicism, and the Dauphin believed. It was the moment the wind changed. A girl with a banner stepping onto the stage of history to rewrite the fate of nations. She that was enough to turn the tide. The skepticism of the generals melted before her gaze, a fire that burned with the absolute certainty of the divine, lighting the way in the dark. She was an anomaly, a miracle, an impossibility made flesh, riding a white horse into the mouth of hell. The soldiers looked at her and saw a saint. The English looked and saw a witch, but both saw something that terrified them: the power of absolute conviction. She didn't formulate strategy, she channeled it, cutting through the complexities of siege warfare with the simple, brutal logic of faith. Attack, believe, win. Simple words that turned a routed army into a conquering host, marching behind a teenage girl who held a sword she had never used, and a banner that meant more than life itself. She was the spark in the powder keg. Orleans was dying, starving under the English yoke, until the maid arrived. She didn't lead from the rear. She climbed the ladders, a white standard in the chaos of battle, shouting into the teeth of the arrows, "Go forward!" When the arrow pierced her shoulder, she pulled it out and kept fighting, crying not from pain, but from the need to see her country free. Her courage was contagious, turning defeated men into lions. She dragged the Dauphin to Reims, through enemy lines, to place the crown on his head, fulfilling the prophecy. She was a shepherdess, guiding a nation back from the precipice of oblivion, execution, the impossible, with a prayer on her lips. She rode at the head of the charge, a symbol of purity in a landscape of mud and blood. The English trembled, believing she was a witch, for no mortal girl could fight with such ferocity. The bells of Orleans rang out, forcing the darkness to retreat. She was the conscience of France, waking it from a long nightmare, proving that a single soul, burning with righteousness, is more powerful than an army of iron. She didn't just win a battle, she saved a culture, turning the tide of the 100 Years' War with a banner and a prayer, giving a voice to the voiceless. But the world is cruel to its saints. The fire that burned within her eventually became the fire that would consume her. Betrayed by politics, sold for gold, she faced her judges alone, a girl against the might of the church and state, answering their traps with a simple, devastating truth: if I am not in God's grace, may He put me there. They burned her in the marketplace, hoping to destroy the symbol. But the flames only purified the legend. As she cried out the name of Jesus, even the executioner wept, knowing they had burned something holy. Her heart remained unburnt in the ashes, a testament to a spirit that could not be extinguished. Now the ash is gone, scattered in the river, but the legend stands in every church in France, reminding us that the spirit is stronger than the flame. The smoke rose to the heavens, carrying her soul back to the voices that had started it all in the quiet of a garden long ago. She accomplished in 1 year what kings could not do in a lifetime, finding the heart of a nation and giving it back to them, a martyr who died for a country that abandoned her, only to be resurrected as its eternal patron, shining through the stained glass, forever young, forever brave, and forever free. He was the lawgiver, the magnificent, a sultan who wore the world like a ring. He began as a quiet goldsmith, but the throne revealed a conqueror. He cracked the gates of Europe, taking Belgrade, dominating the Mediterranean. The shadow of the Ottoman crescent fell across the disorganized kings of the West, sending tremors through the Vatican. He was the apex, the caliph of Islam, marching his armies to the walls of Vienna, declaring that the sun would rise in the east and set wherever he commanded. He wore a helmet of 4 tiers, rivaling the Pope's tiara, signaling that he was the Caesar of Rome, the Khan of the Turks, and the shadow of God, all in one. His fleet ruled the waves, his armies ruled the land, and his law ruled the hearts of millions. The turban he wore was a shroud, a reminder of death, but his life was a celebration of power, unrivaled and absolute. The Janissaries marched effectively, a machine of war that knew no fear, only the will of the Sultan. Marketplaces from Baghdad to Budapest thrived under his peace, a golden age where justice was swift and the architecture was sublime. He was the center of the world, the pole star around which history revolved, sitting on a throne of gold, dispensing fate with a wave of his hand, believing that the House of Osman was the final, perfect expression of God's will on earth. Istanbul blossomed under his hand, Sinan building domes that floated on light, a golden age of law and art. But beneath the glory was a heart that broke the rules. He married Roxolana, a slave girl who captured the emperor. It was a love story that reshaped the empire, a partnership of poetry and power. For decades, the world revolved around Topkapi Palace, where the scribe's pen was as mighty as the Janissary's sword, and the empire breathed with the confidence of the chosen, a golden age of law, of art, of power, intertwined in a tapestry of brilliance. The tulips bloomed in the gardens, red as the blood of the empire's enemies, marking the season of the Ottomans, a time when it seemed the crescent moon would never set. The tiles of the blue mosque reflected the sky, blurring the line between heaven and earth. just as he blurred the line between man and legend. He sat in the window of the harem, watching the Bosphorus flow, the master of two seas and two continents. Yet he was a poet, writing verses under the name Muhibbi, exploring the vulnerability of the heart, even as his armies crushed the resistance of the world, a complex soul trapped in the golden cage of absolute power, longing for a peace he could never truly find. But power demands a blood price. The harem became a snake pit, and the Sultan, afraid of his own shadow, ordered the silence of the bowstring. He killed his own son, sacrificing the future to secure the present. He died in a tent on a muddy campaign, an old man projected as a puppet to keep the troops marching. The magnificence faded into tragedy, proving that even the master of the world is a slave to time. Now the Suleymaniye stands, but the house of Osman is dust, a lesson in the transient nature of earthly glory, leaving behind domes that catch the morning light, and a history written in the ink of triumph and regret. The call to prayer still echoes over his city, but the Sultan sleeps alone in the silence of his tomb, dreaming of a world that once trembled at his name, now busy with the small lives of those who have forgotten him. The lawgiver made laws for millions, but he broke the laws of nature, trying to hold on to power forever. His legacy is not just the stone and the gold, but the tragedy of a father who chose his throne over his son, a dark stain on the magnificent tapestry that time cannot wash away, allowing us to see the man beneath the turban. He was the scourge of God, the punishment sent for the sins of Rome. He didn't want to rule the world, he wanted to burn it. He united the tribes with a will of iron, creating an empire of the bow. He looked at the decaying carcass of Rome and saw a feast. He extorted gold, terrified emperors, and turned civilization into a protection racket. Was he a king or a force of nature, a storm sweeping from the steppes to remind the soft men of the cities that the wolves are always waiting? He sat on a wooden throne while his guests ate off silver, mocking the decadence of the world he was about to destroy. Knowing that gold does not stop iron, he was the nightmare that civilization tells itself to keep the children in line, a darkness that came from the east, swallowing the light of the west, leaving only bones and smoke in his wake. The grass withered where his horse trod, and the rivers ran dry in fear. He was the Antichrist of the ancient world, a destroyer who built nothing, wrote nothing, preserved nothing, leaving only a void where cities once stood, exacting a tribute of terror from a world that had forgotten how to fight, proving that civilization is a fragile garden easily trampled by the hooves of the wild, forever waiting just outside the gate. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains was the clash of the Titan armies. The slaughter was so great, legend says, the ghosts of the fallen continued fighting in the sky. He was checked, but not broken. He turned to Rome itself, marching to the gates. Only the Pope stood in his way, an old man and a barbarian warlord meeting in the mist. What was said, history does not know, but the scourge turned back, sparing the eternal city, a mystery that hangs over the end of the ancient world like a suspended breath. Perhaps he saw the shadow of God behind the old man, or perhaps he simply knew that to destroy the heart is to become the beast, and he chose to remain simply Attila. The retreat was not a defeat, it was a mercy, a strange and terrible mercy from a man who knew none. He rode back to the Hungarian plains, leading an army laden with gold, but heavy with the knowledge that Rome was not yet ready to die. He left the city standing, a monument to the power of the church and the curious, sudden hesitation of a monster, allowing the light of civilization to flicker for a few more years. The end came not by the sword, but by the vine. He died in a drunken stupor, choking on his own blood on his wedding night. The terror of the world, silenced by a nosebleed. His warriors cut their faces, mourning him with blood, not tears. They buried him in a river, diverting the water to hide the grave, then killed those who dug it. He vanished into the earth, leaving no trace. The empire evaporated, but the scar remains, a memory of the time when the world trembled at the sound of hooves in the dark, confirming that even the greatest storms eventually blow themselves out, leaving only silence and the grass that grows over the graves of kings, concealing their secrets forever. The wind sweeping across the Hungarian plain still carries his name, a whisper of the time when the world almost ended under the hooves of his horses. The Huns were the shadow that frightened the West into unity, the nightmare that woke Europe from its slumber. Attila built nothing, but he destroyed enough to ensure that the world would never be the same again. A catalyst of chaos, vanishing into the mist, leaving history to wonder if he ever really existed, or if he was just a bad dream, the bogeyman who comes for those who forget to be strong.